Hey everybody, it's Korie with CVMA, and today we're here to talk about stances. And particularly, we're going to talk about 4 fundamental concepts that apply to all stances. So as you're going through the videos that we'll have for the different stances for the beginner and advanced curriculum, you're going to be able to apply these 4 concepts in each of those stance videos to make your stances more effective, more stable, and better for combat. So the first concept we're going to look at is joint stacking. So the idea of joint stacking is if I'm standing straight up, my foot, knee, and hip are all in a straight line. So this lends to being more stable and secure when you're standing, because if I bend my knees here or I move my knees at a different angle, I'm putting stress on the different joints because they're not in alignment. When you're in your stances, joint stacking is critical to the structure of your stance. So for example, when we look at a front stance, with the front leg taking most of the weight, it's pretty imperative that this leg has proper joint stacking. Now, from the foot to the knee, this should be a straight line. So what I want to avoid is this knee fanning outside the body or fanning inside the body. If this knee fans out or in, as I take force, this stance is going to give at the weak point, which at this point is the knee. And this is going to cause the knee either to fall in or fall out, which is really going to damage my foot. So when you're in a front stance, you want to make sure that the knee and the foot are in a straight line. When you take force, this allows for those joints to react in such a way that they feed that energy through the body as opposed to exiting out the point of weakness. All stances have some sort of joint stacking in them. So front stance, for example, I've got knee to foot, joint stacking. If I go into a back stance, I have joint stacking on this weight on the leg that's taking most of the weight. Again, knee directly over the foot, not fanning in, fanning out, fanning past, or straightening out. So as you're going through different stances, you have to look at your positioning and make sure that your joints are stacked appropriately. Especially for horse stance, where both feet are taking equal weight, that joint stacking is really important. You want to avoid these knees pulling into the body or fanning out. You want them to remain right over top of those feet to give you proper support. So first topic, joint stacking. The second thing we're going to talk about is weight distribution. So every stance has some sort of weight distribution. So you'll hear us say 60-40, 70-30, 90-10. This is the percentage of weight that goes on each leg. So again, if we take front stance as an example, front stance is a 60-40 stance. So 60% of the weight's on the front leg, 40% is on the back leg. What I want to avoid here is making this stance 50-50, where I end up standing straight up, and now I'm really, I'm unable to maintain my balance. I'm open to attack. I'm open to manipulation in any direction because I don't have proper rooting to the ground. So by putting this weight in place, now I'm strong against attacks where this stance is meant to absorb energy, and I'm at a better position to move if I need to. So in this case, again, there's the proper joint stacking of the leg. That's going to help when I distribute weight that I don't give in this stance and cause myself some instability there as well. So in a back stance, for example, which has a 70-30 distribution, more weight goes on the back leg than the front. But again, the front leg does take some weight. If I try to take all the weight off, I'm really going to throw my body back, which is going to make this stance not as stable. So when we talk about different stances, we talk about their weight distribution, you'll sometimes hear us say a support leg and a stabilizing leg. All this means is the leg that takes the most weight is the support leg. This leg's job is to keep you from being on the ground, crumbling directly down. So if I'm putting weight out, this leg is going to be my support leg. It's going to make sure that I don't, as I start putting weight down, that I'm just not going to fall to the ground with it. So your support leg is the leg taking most of the weight. Now your stabilizer leg, its job is to make sure you don't tip over. So as I put weight down, my center of gravity is still going to be a little further back than my foot, which means that gravity is going to start pulling me straight down where my hips are. So my stabilizer leg is sort of like a kickstand. It makes sure that I don't tip, and that little bit of energy that I get coming backwards is not going to pull me to the ground as well. So when you're in this stance, it's real important that that support leg, again, maintains proper joint stacking so that when you distribute that weight and it becomes a support leg, it doesn't give. In a back stance, same idea applies. So here, the leg taking most weight is my back leg. It's now the support leg. My front leg becomes the stabilizing leg. In a horse stance, where the weight is evenly distributed, both legs are doing both jobs. So they're taking the weight, they're supporting me, and they're also making sure that I don't tip. With my hips being in the center of this stance and the legs both taking the same amount of weight, they end up providing both functions. So we have joint stacking and we have weight distribution. The third concept is hip position. So in every stance, almost as critical as your joints being stacked is knowing where your hips are. So again, we'll take front stance for an example. If I'm in a front stance, I've got proper joint stacking on this leg. I've got 60% of the weight here, 40% of the weight in the back. My hips naturally kind of come to the center of this stance. What you have to watch for is if your hips start to lean out in either direction or they start to roll forward, they're going to cause instability in this stance. So for example, if I'm in a front stance, and if you watch my back leg, as my hips start riding forward, my back foot starts to come up off the ground. This is going to ruin the structure of this stance, and it's going to make me vulnerable to attack. Similarly, if I'm in a front stance and I start rolling my hips out to the right, you can see my foot starting to give here, knee starting to come out of alignment here, and this is really going to put me in a bad spot. So I want to make sure that my hips remain in the center of this. So not all stances have their hips directly in the center of a stance. So for example, a back stance, hips are actually a little further back. So in a back stance's case, instead of being in the center, which would cause me to be equal weight on both legs, I'm actually going to shift a little more toward the back leg, which is going to give me the structure that I'm looking for, especially if I'm retreating or ending a retreat and getting ready to come back forward. So, but I have to know where my hips are. They don't necessarily have to be in the center every time, but you have to know where they're supposed to be in the stance. Horse stance, pretty much directly in the center. Having your weight in the center with both legs kind of kicked out to the side is going to give you the most stability from the sides and make sure that if you are taking an attack from this side, this is probably about the strongest place you can be. So every stance has a proper hip position, so you need to know what that is in order to make sure that the structure of your stance is secured. So we have joint stacking, we have weight distribution, we have hip position, and the final concept is dead zone. So imagine you're out talking on your cell phone, you got good signal, everything's working well, and then all of a sudden your call drops, you look at your phone, you have no signal. You've entered a dead zone. No longer can transmit signal to you. All stances have this idea of a dead zone. So, for example, a front stance is real effective if you're coming directly at me or I'm coming directly at you. But what if my opponent was coming from an angle? This stance is not real safe at that angle. So the easiest way to find a dead zone is if you had a third leg, where would you put it? So, for example, in this stance, I wouldn't put the third leg up front or behind me here because that's where I'm already strong. I'd either put it out to the angle here or out to the angle behind me. Those are your dead zones. So if I get pushed in this direction, I'm going to probably fall. If I get pushed directly forward, I'm pretty safe. So these would be my dead zones for my front stance. Back stance, same idea. If I had one more leg to put down, I'd either put it here or behind me. Those are the dead zones of this stance. If I was in horse stance, if I had a third leg go in front of me or behind me, that's, again, the dead zone of this stance, and this stance being strong, coming directly to either side. Any stance that you have your feet together in, you typically have a dead zone all around you because you can be manipulated in any direction with relative ease. So every stance has its own purpose, its own strengths, its own weaknesses, so you have to know which one to use in combat. So if your attacker's coming directly forward, you have a lot of options. You can come back stance here, you can go front stance here, you can maintain horse stance this way, but you wouldn't want to go horse stance this way, right? Because that's going to apply to the dead zone of the stance. So when you're talking about defense and you're talking about combat, you want to make sure that your dead zones of your stance aren't exposed, but your opponent's dead zones are. And the wider a stance gets, the more a dead zone is created, right? So if my dead zone is here and I start to move my foot, this dead zone is going to start to widen pretty heavily until I end up in a split where you don't really have any structure at all. So as you're going through stances and working through these, remember these four concepts. Joint stacking, making sure knee to foot is all in alignment, especially on the support leg. Weight distribution, making sure that you're not putting too much weight on one leg or not enough. Hip position, making sure that the hip is either supposed to be directly in the center of the stance, shifted a little more backwards, or shifted a little more forwards. You just have to know where it's going and how it affects the structure of your stance. And finally, your dead zone, knowing where the stance is strong versus knowing where the stance is weak. As you go through the videos on our site for all the stances, you should be able to apply these 4 concepts to all of them. So what I would suggest is write them down on a piece of paper beside you, and as you're going through a front stance video or a back stance video, you're going to look at each one and call out what joints should be stacked, where should my weight be, where should my hips be, and where are the strengths and weaknesses of this stance. This is going to help you as you apply these in defense. You'll know everything about these stances and it'll become a little more natural to you. So I'm Korie with CVMA. This was Fundamental Concepts of Stances. So keep working on this stuff. We'll see you next time.